Welcome to Mating Matters, the podcast that looks at human behavior through a lens of evolutionary psychology and human mating strategy. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh. On today's show, the Neuroscience of Attachment, or can your attachment style predict if you will trust a robot? More to come on that. My guest is Dr. Omri Gillath. He's a professor of the Department of Psychology at the University of Kansas. He has spent more than 20 years doing research, teaching psychology, mentoring students. I promise you, he is a leading figure in the field of close relationships. He has published over 100 articles in leading outlets in his field. Now, his research focuses on close relationships and what motivates human behavior when it comes to attachment, giving care, and sexual mating. He also examines biological evidence of attachment using neuroimaging, physiological measures, and endocrine markers. He has looked at attachment style in relationship to kindness, social networks, relationship goals, and sexual attitudes. And recently, he has been studying the associations between attachment style and relationships with artificial intelligence. Oh yeah, would you trust a self-driving car? Would you trust a robot? Do you trust Siri? He's got the answers of why you may or may not. Two of his published books include Relationship Science, Integrating Evolutionary Neuroscience and Sociocultural Approaches, and the other is called Adult Attachment, a concise introduction to theory and research. If you want more, don't miss his amazing TED Talk, The Power of Secure Love. Welcome, Omri Gillath.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you because you are in the trenches doing the work that I only get to report on. I always like to start out my interviews, though, by getting to know the scientist a little better personally. And I know that my listeners are always curious about what's behind the minds. So can I ask you from a personal level, what inspired you to study attachment and evolutionary psychology?
Right. So, I was always interested in close relationships. I always wondered about things like friendship and sexuality. It's such a fascinating thing to understand human behavior in that way, and to understand, for example, why some people have friends, others don't. Why is it hard for people to find a partner? So I always wanted to understand that. I also was interested in clinical work and understanding, the psyche of people, and attachment provides all of that. It's such a broad theory that touches on all of these things, and you can study and use it as a multi-tool in a way to study all of these things. So that was the perfect framework for me to use.
And has studying attachment theory helped you in your personal life at all?
Yes and no. So I know what I need to do and what's supposed to happen, and that helps to some extent. On the other hand, when you are involved emotionally in something, like being a parent yourself, knowing is not always doing, and that puts pressure and kind of like, I could have been more secure in my behavior, or I should have done that, a better way. So I guess sometimes.
I get asked that question a lot, and I always say, sometimes I have trouble seeing the forest because I'm stuck in the trees with my kids or whatever little entanglement is happening at the moment.
Absolutely. Right. And I think that this is a question actually that I talk about with my students, because many of them come to my class and say, I want to become an expert in close relationships and make my relationships better. So, there is a degree to which you can, understand things better, but that doesn't mean that everything is going to be, hunky-dory from now on and everything's going to be a paradise, right? It's one thing to know, it's a different thing to be able to behave and control.
Well, before all my listeners give up, turn this off, and get disappointed, let me tell you that I believe we are all wounded healers, and that on some level we teach best what we most need to learn. And I can honestly say in the evolution of my particular lifespan that my relationship skills have gotten better and better and better because of the research. Literally, I will go and look something up and I will say to my boyfriend, we need more novelty. What can we do that's different for both of us, where I put you in a different schema and you look like a new fresh partner to me?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think that that's true, for anything and everything that we do. I mean, we need to be smart consumers. We need to read about things. We need to know the science. I wasn't trying to say that things don't help me or don't help other people. I'm sure that they do. And I found many, opportunities in my life to use that. So absolutely, I agree with you that knowing things is always the key.
And we are at a time in history now where attachment theory has finally trickled out into the mainstream population. I think during the pandemic, more people read the book Attached than, it was published 10 years ago, than
Right.
ever before. Social media, if you go on my TikTok channel, hashtag attachment style, attachment theory, millions and millions of views of people looking for information. Why do you think now? Why is it a perfect storm in our sociocultural history that attachment theory is so talked about?
Right. So I think that, the two things that you mentioned, both Amir Levine's book, and Amir is a good friend, and we talked about it a lot, and I think he did an amazing job with making it very accessible. So that helped a lot. And obviously TikTok, my daughter who is, 15, comes to me and say, "Oh, Dad, do you know about attachment theory?" And I said, "Yeah, I studied it for, a year or two." and there are all of these TikToks with hundreds of thousands of likes and millions of views, as you said. So accessibility is definitely a big deal. The other thing is, I think there is a connection with the pandemic. As you said, we have a lot of stress on our close relationships. And just to give you a few examples, being stuck at home with the same people, 24/7 is a stressor. And small things can become very big. And it's like, having some kind of amplifier at home that amplifies everything and anything that we do. So people want to know more about it, want to find solutions, want to try to make their relationships better, want to find, ways to make more friends and stuff because of all of the constraint that we have. So I think the pandemic has a lot to do with that. And also, if you think about that, part of the limitations that we have and part of living this new reality of a virtual existence demands, finding new ways, and attachment provides some of that.
It provides a perfect explanation for feelings of loss and depression. Even though you're talking to a lot of people on screens, you're not getting the dopamine and the oxytocin, or maybe you have an anxious attachment style that you were not aware of before. So you're right. What's going on is both amplifying our issues, but it's also showing us how important having good bonds is to human mental health.
Right. I think there is no replacement. This is I think, an ongoing argument that I had with some of my colleagues. Are online relationships a good enough replacement for offline, right? So, some folks blame me for being old and not willing to go with the new technology and understand these new exciting, options, opportunities. But I think that, being next to your loved one, being able to, touch them, smell them, see them, see the nuances, because, it's like with emails. Sometimes when you email with a person, you don't get the nuances. You don't hear their voice. You don't know what they mean. You don't know if they're looking at you or, gaze into your eyes or not. So I agree that there's no replacement for that. But also, because of how things are set, we need to figure out, okay, what would be the next thing for us to do? We need to study that and figure out, when we are doing things online, how can we make them better? What would be the code? Because this is relatively a new thing. We're dealing with things that weren't here before, 5, 10, 15 years ago. So we need to figure out ways to deal with them and do them in the right, polite and respectful way.
I think when we finally have FaceTime or Zoom that comes with pheromones shooting through your computer, that would help. And
they are doing studies about smell. So I think it's not that far ahead, that far in the future that things like that would happen. But still, think about, being able to touch, the shoulder of someone else, to hold hands, to feel the warmth. There are so many studies about touch. Getting a hug from a mom or a friend or a loved one, there's no replacement for that.
Exactly. As you said that, I am sitting in a studio with producer Kayla. She is behind plexiglass. I'm on the other side of plexiglass. And I immediately reached out my hands to try to reach for her. And she reached back as an impulse because that's what we are wired to do. Which brings me to my next question. For people who are just catching up, even though you and I have been talking about attachment theory for 20 years, assuming they just came onto this podcast and are saying, what's attachment theory? What does this have to do with evolutionary psychology? Can you give us your best elevator pitch that explains why we evolved to have an attachment system?
Sure. The idea, the simple idea, this is why I think that attachment is so popular as a theory, is that we have a need to belong, a need to be a part of a relationship. And Bowlby, who was the kind of the father of attachment theory in a way, talked about us as part of many other animals and mammals and so on, who are born when we are helpless and needy, and we need our caregivers to survive. So the attachment system kicks in when we are encountering a stressor or a threat. And as soon as that happens, the attachment system kicks in and guides us to seek proximity to someone else who is smarter and stronger and can provide us support and soothe us and help us and regulate our emotions and so on. So early on, the attachment system is basically making sure that we survive. So if a child is feeling cold or hungry or afraid, the system would kick in and get the child to get closer, either by reaching out, as you just did with Guyline, right? Reach your head, or cry, or do anything that would get the parent's attention, and then the parent's caregiving system, the other side of it, would kick in and hopefully provide the help that is needed, and then the attachment can kind of relax, go back to baseline, and other things can happen.
But then it becomes a somewhat hardwired attachment system that takes people into their adult romantic lives. Explain that connection.
Right. So the way that Bowlby talks about it, he said attachment is there from the cradle to the grave. So it's always important. Now, whether it's exactly the same when you're in childhood and adulthood, that's a different question. And I would say not exactly, because obviously the functions of attachment are a bit different, right? In adulthood, you don't need mom to pick you up and put you on her shoulder and let you cry. You're an adult now, you internalize many of these things. But the idea is that the early experiences throughout along the way are shaping what we call an attachment style, your way of thinking and feeling and behaving in close relationships. So how you approach a new person and a new relationship is kind of depending on the kind of models that you have about yourself and about others. So if you have a positive model of the self, if you think that you're worthy of being loved, you will approach a relationship differently than if you think you don't deserve to be loved. And if you think that other people would be there for you, you're going to trust them and depend on them and let them get close, that would be very different than thinking that people are cold and rejecting and would never be there for you when you need them.
And what people often have trouble understanding is that, they think love is absolutely all about luck and it's just a fluke and it's whatever partner happens to come into their eye line that day. And the truth is, unconsciously, we will go out and actually seek partners who make us feel the way we felt when we were pre-verbal, even if we don't have hard memories of that, right?
This is interesting. There are actually studies about that, about the kind of people that we're searching. Are we all looking for someone who is secure? Are we looking for someone who's more like us? So if I'm anxious, am I looking for someone who's anxious as well? Or am I looking for the opposite? Like, am I looking for someone who is avoidant? And it's interesting. In a way, there is some support for any of these options. It's true that the majority of people are secure themselves and are looking for secure others because that makes the relationship much easier to navigate. But there's other people that would look for, as you said, something that they're used to. So they prefer the kind of relationship, even if it's insecure, with someone who is insecure that they had before, whether that was their ex-partner or, as you said, mom or dad or whatever kind of relationship that they had before. So there is kind of a fight there between wanting someone who can provide me the needs and fulfill the functions of safe haven and secure base and stuff like that, or finding someone who is similar. And as you said, some of this is happening outside of my awareness. I might be, falling in love for someone because of their smell or because they remind me of, my parent without me even thinking about it.
Exactly. It's trying to make the unconscious a little more conscious that I think can help so many people. Dr. Omri Gillath, one of the things I love about your work is that you put attachment theory into physiological, quantifiable data. You know, a lot of people think that psychological theories are just these unprovable, exist as ideas out in the ethereal, and they can't be proven by science. But that's not how you work. Can you tell me a little bit about the kinds of measures that you use in your research to actually see and document attachment?
Absolutely. And you know, a good theory, the theory that you can test, if you can test a theory and prove it right or wrong, then you know, I said don't use it, right? To be scientific, to be able to trust what you're finding, you got to have this a theory or theoretical model that you can test, and you can put hypotheses, and you can see if they work or not. And the measure that we're using in the lab, you know, they're very kind of like a diverse set of measures. We use things, you know, sometimes like heart rate and skin conductance and blood pressure. Other times we use things like, you know, cortisol or oxytocin, which, you know, are hormones that are related to all kinds of, or neurotransmitters. They're related to things like stress and reward. Other times we use things like fMRI, right, which basically allows us to look at someone's brain activation or brain volume and see how these things correlate with their attachment style. So it kind of depends on what we're interested in at a specific, you know, study and the kind of measure that we're using. And when there's still other studies where we use things like self-reports and interviews and observations, there are many different measures, and our attempt is to get all of them and get what we call convergent validity, right? If all of these measures are showing us similar things, then we feel that, you know, what the things that we find can be more trustworthy and we can go on with it.
I'm particularly fascinated by your studies that use functional MRI, where you put people in tubes in MRI machines, you show them pictures of what, and watch where their brain lights up where.
Right. So, you know, these studies can be either pictures of their loved ones, right, where we, you know, ask them to think about, you know, their significant other or their romantic partner or a friend as compared with someone, you know, neutral, or there are studies where we ask them to think about what it would feel like to have a fight or an argument with their partner, or to, you know, God forbid their partner is leaving them or died, for example. We had a study where we put people in the scanner and asked them to imagine for a couple of minutes what it would be, you know, to come back home and imagine a policeman standing there and telling them, you know, unfortunately, your partner just died in a car accident. So we're trying to activate the attachment system and make people go through this part of imagination where they would feel stress, kind of like what we talked about the baby, right? When the baby feels cold or, you know, feels cold or hunger and stuff like that. But with adults, you know, it won't just help to take away mom out of the lab, right? We need to make them think about separation and loss, and that's one way to do it. And then we look at what, you know, kind of lights up in their brain. And when we do that, we see, for example, that there are some areas that are associated with emotions, like the amygdala, which is associated with fear, that lights up when we talk about things like rejection and separation.
So what if that doesn't? What if the amygdala doesn't light up, and you ask them to imagine your partner dying?
Yeah, I mean, so you know, the question is kind of like why it didn't, right? So there can be all kinds of answers to that. One of them is that maybe they didn't imagine it or didn't fully kind of believe the whole set of instructions, or maybe they're suppressing it. So then there are other areas of the brain that are involved in thought suppression where they might be doing what we ask them to, but at the same time trying to separate it and make it, you know, kind of go away. So people who are avoidantly attached tend to do that anyhow. They try not to think about things that are about relationships. They try not to feel these, you know, warm, fuzzy emotions that we talked about, like love and closeness and stuff. So they might be less likely to show this higher activation, like in the amygdala, whereas people who are more anxious are likely to show more activation in the amygdala or in the hippocampus, which is related to memory. And they might have this flood of negative memories, you know, that are associated with these rejection.
It is so fascinating that we are at a stage where you can pretty much see attachment style on a screen.
Right, but remember, the very early studies of attachment were about seeing attachment in the lab. So you know, Ainsworth, when she came up with the strange situation, was looking at how toddlers behave in the lab with a stranger in a strange situation and how they respond to being separated from their caregiver and then reunited with their care. So attachment had this component from the start, the ability to go beyond just a theory and something on paper to something in the lab, in real life, in real behavior, whether, there were observations that Mary Ainsworth did in Uganda when she did her field research, or later on in the lab when she did the strange situation, or with many other studies about physiology. And so fMRI is just one extra, a tool or device that allows us to specifically look at brain activation, but it's not, the oddball in the research of attachment.
There's a video that I show to my health psychology students that is a strange situation test being performed at, I'm pretty sure it's the Albert Einstein School of Medicine. And what they do is to do a saliva test before and after the parent leaves on the baby. Mm-hmm. And so they can see that some babies look very calm, but their hormones show that the stress hormones show that they're actually quite aroused. And now we know the long-term negative health impact of attachment injuries early in life, that it can actually, it's not just about finding a mate or keeping a mate or having a happy relationship. It can increase all kinds of health conditions.
Right. And being in a situation where you have chronic stress is never a good thing. We have studies that we show that actually some parts of your brain are shrinking in size, like the hippocampus that I mentioned before, when you experience, traumatic events. So, think about other studies, for example, on people that have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We see that their hippocampus is smaller than the hippocampus of people that don't have this kind of trauma. Same is happening with people that have an insecure attachment style. They have a smaller size of hippocampus, so parts of their brain are actually smaller because of toxicity that is supposedly caused from this long-term chronic stress. And as you said, there is also a connection between having a sense of security and safety and growing up with these relationships that can help you and being less ill and sick and even, living longer, right? So there are many studies now showing, not just even within attachment, within the research of close relationships in general, that relationships are super important for our health and longevity.
Yes, secure love helps extend our lives. I would be remiss if I did not bring up robots, because you have done so much research on artificial intelligence, and some of the research is fascinating to me, especially as you correlated with attachment style. I want to start by telling you a cute story. The other day, I was walking down the street, and I saw one of these small robots that was delivering food, on the sidewalk. Mm-hmm. And it hit a bump, or must have hit a bump just before I arrived, because it had fallen over on its side and the little wheels were spinning and spinning. And people walked past. Nobody was doing anything. And yet this one person pulled their car over in traffic, got out of their car, righted the little robot, and he continued on. He flashed his lights, thank you, with a bunch of little flashes, and went on his way. Could you tell me something about the attachment style of the driver of that car?
Yeah, I would assume that the guy is secure in his behavior. But, this is fascinating, because how do we treat a machine, right? How do we look at something that is, for most people, just a tool, right? And even the way that you describe it, right, with the flashing his little lights and his little wheels are spinning. So the way that you describe it, you almost talked about a little human being in a way. So
right, when you picture the spinning wheels, it's like little hands or feet waving, right?
Right. So we have the capability and the tendency to look at things around us, even inanimate objects, as if they have their own feelings and emotions and so on. So that's fascinating. And, the way that the technology is moving forward, even now, and I'm moving into a totally different place here, there are, for example, sex robots that are, first of all, super expensive, right? They would be like $30,000, $40,000 that have an AI, and people buy them to, use them as a companion, obviously for, the sexual reasons, in part, but also to be able to have a conversation with them and to have a hug and human, in double quotes, interaction. So I think that we're on the verge of this scary, fascinating, science fiction kind of like, world where technology had moved on, and we have all of these robot companions and AIs that, you see AI today everywhere. We see, in therapy, right? We see it in schools, right? Making decisions about who would get into the university. AI is basically kind of like Alexa, Siri. Right?
Oh, I will not let that Siri girl around. That Alexa is not allowed in my house. Siri, I'm sorry. Did I offend you right now? I know you're probably listening. So what would that take?
Should we be more careful about it? Right? I mean, the way that you said it, right? Some people are definitely afraid of it. The apocalypse is coming, but the research haven't caught up with it, and we don't know what are the implications of having such robots, in home and AI. So, there are a handful of studies. Like, for example, kids that grew up with Alexa at home tend to talk differently with adults. They are much less polite and more rude in their approach to adults because they're used to talk to a machine.
And yet my teenager laughs at me whenever I say please or thank you or I'm sorry to Siri. So I did the other way.
I do that too. And in Japan, they actually, because they have an older population that, not always have the solutions for who's going to take care of them, they try to come up with an alternative that would be an artificial companion, whether it's like a cute little seal or something else that basically, think about your older parents, right? Instead of you going visiting them and taking care of them, you'd put a machine with them that would, know that they're, whatever they're saying and chat with them and make sure that they're still alive and stuff like that, right? But is that the kind of solution that we want to have? Is that where we're going with our societal and cultural changes?
So let's connect this to attachment theory. One survey I read showed that only 44% of humans would ever get in a self-driving Uber car. So what would you say about this? Like, people who have a secure attachment are going to trust a robot more, or people who are more anxious or avoidant?
Yeah, so from our studies, it seems that people that are more secure, whether it's their attachment style or if we prime them with a sense of security, so we make them feel more secure temporarily, are more likely to trust AIs and robots and so on. The study that we did, had self-driving cars, but they had also other things. So other, apps that might have, would you trust an AI to match you up, right? Would you trust AI to fly your airplane, which today, for example, it's already happening, right? So
right.
A lot of the flights are being controlled by AIs. And the thing is that, if you look at the numbers, if all cars were driven by AIs, right, there would probably be much less accidents and much less fatality. But every time that something bad happens and a car, goes and hit a pedestrian or kill them, right, obviously we get tons of attention. So I think that on the one hand, we do see less trust and less willingness to get AI into all of these things. On the other side, we see that AI and the industry is moving forward, and AI is probably going to replace truck driver very soon, and we'll see more AIs as workers in factories and stuff. So it's going to happen. We need to be ready. We need to think as psychologists, especially, we need to think about, okay, what are the implications here? What can we do to prepare for it?
It's fascinating because I really think it has to do with this feeling of control or not. I mean, far more people are afraid of flying, even though there are fewer deaths ever from airplane crashes than they are for driving their own car. They drive their own car. They have this sense of control, even though, like, even driving here to this interview, I almost took out a motorcyclist. Sorry. A girl motorcyclist, no less. So, on the other hand, I was driving a Tesla, and I could have simply had it on self-drive, and that girl would not be in danger.
Actually, a Tesla just hit a couple of pedestrians and killed them, and now they're blaming the driver, although it was self-driving. So, I mean, I think that we have all kinds of moral and ethical questions, but attachment is right there at the center, because that suggests that we need to think about the psychology and not just the computer sciences, side of things, right? So often engineers are the ones who are leading the revolution, right? And we're basically in the midst or in the beginning of this huge revolution with AI, right? It is probably going to change all of our lives. And so we need to remember that psychology is a very important part of it, and we need to make sure that humans and AIs would get along without, killing each other.
But what does attachment say? If I'm afraid to use my car on self-drive and I don't like that my airplanes are being driven by AI, does this mean I have more of an insecure attachment style?
Probably, and it means that, you might have a reason, right? Maybe something happened, and again, you might be more aware of accident that happened like that. But we do see from our studies that people tend to be less trustworthy if they're insecure. So if you don't trust other humans, right, you're also less likely to trust things like AI.
Fascinating. Okay, before we go, I like to close my interviews with a little bit of what I call news you can use. Having done this for 20 years, all your research, I'm sure that there are two pieces of relationship advice that you could give to the general population. If you could boil down all your decades of research to two pieces of information, what might that be?
I love the question. So one of them is relationships always involve work, hard work, right? You got to invest in your relationships, whether it's with your parents or your spouse or your kids, right? It's not just, the first few, days, weeks, months that you kind of spend time to try to get them, but you also need to keep on working on them. And just like what you said about your boyfriend, right? Bring novelty, bring, new ideas, make it interesting, make it fun, right? So that's one thing. Keep the work. The other thing is that there are ways that we can make people more secure. There are ways to work on it. You can work on it alone, right? For example, we have an app that you can find by searching my name, and that helps you with all kind of playing games and making you feel more secure. If that doesn't help, obviously there are things like therapy, and check out if your partner is actually making you secure, right? If your partner is not making you secure and you are in a relationship that are not good for you, maybe it's time to switch.
So wait, there's an app. There's an app where you can play games with yourself to help you increase feelings of security?
Yep. Absolutely.
What's it called?
So it's called Prime Me. It's the word prime, but the capital M.
Yep.
So the idea is that you're priming yourself, right? And you basically by searching for my name, Gillath, on the App Store or whatever, you can find it, and there are all kinds of cute games. And again, it's about, wanting to change. If you don't want to change, it won't help, right? If you do want to change, if you feel the need to do something about your relationships, that's one way to do it. And it's not a replacement for therapy. I highly respect therapists and clinicians. They do an amazing job, and, you should definitely go see one if you feel the need. But that's something you can do on your own instead of playing, Angry Birds or Candy Crush. Just play an attachment game.
I'm going to prime me. I think I'm going to do a TikTok video on your app, okay?
Okay.
Only 1 million people will see it. That's it.
Doctor,
The Dr. Wendy Walsh Show on KFI AM 640 Los Angeles every Sunday, where we talk about everything in relationships. The good, the bad, the ugly, the smart. Whether you are looking for a relationship, whether you're looking to keep a mate, whether you're looking to recover after you've lost a mate, I have the science of love for you. You can download the iHeartRadio app and listen to the Dr. Wendy Walsh Show anytime. You can also hear it live every Sunday on KFI AM 640. Welcome back to Mating Matters. My guest, Dr. Omri Gillath at the Department of Psychology, the University of Kansas. It's like Kansas. You know why? Because we use the program Canvas at my university.
Yep,
and so whenever I think about a school, I'm thinking of Kansas. But Kansas, it's Kansas. All right, so I want to go through this step by step and some things that came to mind in the abstract that I read of your study that was published in Evolutionary Psychology, one of my favorite publications. And basically, the title, Attachment Security Priming, Affecting Mating Strategies Endorsement Among College Students. If I'm going to translate that into language everybody can understand, it is, let's trick the brain before they meet somebody new, and they're going to make a different choice of whether to have a short-term or long-term relationship based on what the brain saw ahead of time. Does that make sense? Did I get that kind of right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And I mean, tricks has a negative connotation. It's actually, it can be a very positive thing, right?
Well, when I teach priming to my, Psych 101 student, my 100, in the 5 or 6 slides before, the slides get slowly and slowly and slowly more yellow. It's just a creeping thing, and they don't realize it. And then I try to teach them priming, and I say, well, here's an example of priming. Name a fruit. And then the next slide was it a lemon or a banana? And then I go back and show them all the slides and how their brain was primed by this colorization of the slides. So it is a trick.
Absolutely. And what we're doing in the lab is obviously, artificially trying to put them in a specific mode, right? It's something that in real life would be, maybe because of a relationship or something that reminds them something that happened to them. It's very different than showing them pictures or words that we do usually in the lab.
So before we get going on your study and your data, let's talk a little bit about the background. So it's already been proven that if you expose people to cues that make them feel unsafe, like their future survivability is at stake, they're more likely to choose a short-term mating partner than a long-term mating partner. Why is this?
Right. So think about that, right? If you're going to die soon, what from evolutionary perspective, right? If you are, I don't know, seeing, the sky is falling or something like that, at least for half of us, it makes sense to try and have sex and pass forward your genes, right? So for guys, they can just run around, find a willing mate, have sex, and if she is, pregnant, then they basically passing on their genetics. So again, it's think about it from an evolutionary perspective. If our purpose here is to just pass our genetic material to the future, when you know that your opportunities are closing, you're going to do whatever you can to try and increase your chances of doing that. So
I wonder if there's data from the pandemic showing that like Tinder did better than Match.com or something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there are data, when looking at different countries, where countries that are more dangerous or neighborhoods that are more dangerous, you see people starting to have sex when they're younger, having more sexual partners, are actually getting their period at an earlier age, right? So all these things are happening, and our body is acting, even if we're not aware of it, which kind of fits nicely with the idea of priming, that our body is getting ready to pass on the genetic material. So again, the idea is coming from life history theory, where a safe and secure environment is basically getting people to think about the long term. You have a certain amount of resources that you can use. You can invest them in the small amount of offspring and make it all much kind of like higher quality. On the other hand, if you're growing up in a dangerous, unsafe environment where you're going to there are high chances of dying young, and you're going to start early. You're going to try to get as many opportunities to have sex, get pregnant, and so on and so forth.
It's so fascinating because I teach developmental psychology too, and precocious puberty in girls is highly correlated with family conflict, right? So you're in a dangerous home.
Exactly.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, now your study did the opposite. It said, what if we made people feel very secure and safe before they set out to date, mate, and relate? And would they choose better partners that would be fit for long-term relationships? So the first thing I need to know is, how did you make them feel safe? Well, how did you prime them?
Right. So there are different ways to do it. Specifically in these studies, what we're trying to do is to prime them in such a way that they wouldn't expose our goals, right? We didn't want them to kind of figure out or guess what we're trying to do here and then just go along with that. So we wanted to make sure that this is not happening. So we basically exposed them to either images, for example, of a mother holding a baby. That can be, one example, or, a couple hugging, or anything that would make them feel loved and embraced and accepted and so on. It can be also the words, just as I said, the word love, the word hug, the word kiss, all of these things can basically make people, based on our previous research, feel more safe and secure. So that's the way to do it.
And then what would you do? What would you do to see about their mate selection? So now you got them feeling secure, thinking about love and hug and safety and mother and baby and closeness and nurturing. And now what did you do with them?
Right. So then we kind of depend on the study. There were some studies that we basically asked them to choose between different scenarios or different options. Do you prefer to have sex without meaning, or is it okay to have sex without love and things like that, which represent short-term strategies, or, sex got to be with, the right partner, or, you got to have some feelings for a partner before you're having sex with them, right? So that's one example. We use a self-report measure. But we also used a different study where we kind of looked at the behavior. So we had them in an interview with supposedly another participant. And at the end of the interview, the other participant said, "Hey, I don't usually do it, and I know that sounds a bit awkward, but I really like you. I think that we have similar interests, and how about we go out and have a coffee or a drink or something?" So basically, offering them to go on a date. And what we wanted to know is whether or not you're going to go with this other attractive mate after our prime. So basically, we can.
But what if that other attractive mate, they were thinking that was going to be a long-term partner? How did you know?
I mean, it could be, and we don't know. But there are two things. A, if you are already in a relationship and this other person is offering you a date, that's more likely to be a short-term. Right? Yeah, so there is that. Now, if you're not in a relationship, we're assuming that if you say yes. That still suggests a short term, even if later on, right, if we follow up and see if you're actually, obviously that was an imaginary person, so we couldn't test it, but you could potentially kind of follow up and see if in the long term they change it from a short term to a long term. But for us, it was more about, okay, can they actually change their preferences based on these subtle cues in the environment, which is...
So do you have a control group of people that were not given the priming?
Right. So we had a control group of people that were primed with either neutral primes or insecure primes. So we tested these things as well.
So your study, where you took two groups of college students, one group, you did not prime them in any way possible, and you had somebody basically ask them out on a date. The other group, you primed them with feelings of warmth, mommy, love, hug, kisses, baby, nurturing, feelings that bring us attachment, security. All right. What happened with the two groups?
Right. So the one that saw the things like hug and kiss and embrace, and again, they didn't see it, they were exposed to it because it was a subliminal priming. They were much more likely to prefer long-term mating strategies than short-term. So sex without love was not okay for them. And, not finding the right partner was not okay for them.
And you learned this by the survey you gave them afterwards, right?
Right. So we did a survey, and also from their behavior when they said no to the other person who offered them to go on a date. The control group, whether it was neutral priming or, as you said, no prime, or even insecure prime, usually led people to the opposite, to short term. And especially, when with insecure primes, you can do it either avoidant or anxious. And avoidant people are the ones who are usually looking into these kind of like short term mating strategies, playing hard to get, which is another paper that we have. And they're kind of like more into, playing games than actually having a committed relationship. And this is what we saw with the priming.
Yeah, I find that people with an avoidant attachment style, not that I've dated many, thousands, they basically love to find unique ways to obtain sex, but not give up any emotional intimacy. Yeah,
right. And all these things that you hear about ghosting and submarining and all that, these are avoidant people who basically develop like new methods or new names or to kind of do the same thing that they like.
Yeah, people have to understand, in any given mating marketplace, there are always going to be people, everybody knows how to obtain sex in some way because we're put on the planet to reproduce. But how they can extract sex without having to make emotional commitment or reveal emotional to themselves is the purview of the avoidant group. Now, the anxious people scare people away with their anxiety. I think if I had to self-diagnose back when I was single, I'm in a very secure relationship, by the way, Dr. Omri, you would be very proud of me. Took 18 years of therapy and 2 attachment parenting kids to raise. So I go, oh, this is what a secure attachment feels like. But I think I was more of anxious ambivalent. So in other words, I was the come closer, go away girl. I always was attracted to avoidant men, guaranteed. They ghosted, they dismissed, they walked away. I mean, I was like a detective trying to figure out who they were with, where they were going all the time, right? But if I met a guy who had a secure attachment style, who was very open and close and whatever, I would say, ew, he's too nice. And so it really took some getting used to when I got this amazing boyfriend who's such a caregiver. And people are like, but don't you think you now deserve it to be cared for? And I'm like, oh, this is so great. It's so really great. So let's talk about people, what your research means to people who might be looking for a long-term relationship and getting ready to go out on a date or go to an event where they might meet people. Is there anything we could do to kind of self-prime ourselves?
Absolutely. And I mean, the first thing to do is to actually figure out what do you want and what's going to make you feel better, right? So not in every situation and in every relationship, meant to be a long-term. But if you're ready for commitment, if you're ready to get into a relationship that would be, a bit of a long-term rather than a short-term, then you need to kind of lower your anxieties, be more vulnerable a little bit. So, self-priming with security is going to be good, and also priming your partner with some sort of security. So it's kind of like, think about where you're finding your partners, right? So as you said, finding them on Tinder might be to begin with a prime towards the short term, right? Because this is kind of the reputation that we get from Tinder. So maybe find them in different places, Facebook or eHarmony, stuff like that.
Or so real life groups. What about going out to meetups and actually hiking groups of people?
Absolutely. That would be even better. And the other thing is to kind of like think about how you build it and what you're doing. So if you're starting by kind of playing them and trying to have, one over them and stuff like that, that's not going to be a good way to build a trusting relationship. Or if you're putting it in such an environment where it's you feel the threat and the danger, that can end up again not bringing the right of strategies that you would expect from a long-term relationship. So the people use them to fall in love with you, just take them to a bullfight, right? So that they would be all kind of like flustered and excited, and they would misattribute this into, falling in love.
Oh, speaking of misattribution, I'm sure you've read this famous study. I think it was done in Vancouver on that famous suspension bridge that's so high and so terrifying.
Right,
they had a young woman, Confederate of the research study, walk across the bridge, and to a strange man, she would just start a conversation. And at the end, a researcher would say to the man, "Oh, by the way, that woman that walked across the bridge with you, did you find attractive?" With they all had these feelings of love because it was comorbid with fear. They were all mixed up with the fear in their stomach, and there's also been stories of people like, oh, we were on this plane and there was all this turbulence and I was walking down the aisle and I fell right into his lap in the turbulence and we ended up getting married.
Right. So, I mean, the stories are great and the science is there. The question is just where does it lead, right? And if it started with this excitement, would it survive when there is no excitement?
Exactly.
And how would it look?
Yeah. My first book that I wrote before I had any education in this area was called The Boyfriend Test, How to Evaluate His Potential Before You Lose Your Heart. And one of the questions in the boyfriend test was, is he coming off a big win? Has he just won like a Heisman or a Super Bowl ring or an award at work? This is not the time to meet him. Okay, he's not ready to settle down. So
absolutely, there's something about this like mate value where they feel invincible and they would just go on and conquer more and more and more. Might, as you said, not be the best time to settle down.
No, you want to meet them on a low. So
you want to be there high.
You want to be there high, exactly, while they're in there low. So let's talk as we close. In summary, I want to tell people that love is real. Love is out there. We are wired to connect. And that at any given time of your life, you can make love happen. And sometimes it's about doing the internal work of learning to make different choices. And for me, that's what happened, is that I was choosing these quote unquote bad boys for so many years because I liked the high of it. I liked the anxiety of it. And once I got tired of that anxiety and wanted the feelings of safety and security, everything changed for me. I met so many just kind, giving people. And I think that's the big message about attachment overall, is that we do have some control, but we have to become aware of our patterns. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
That is the way to do it. Well, it is always a pleasure to have you on the show. If people can, you have a website, don't you, Dr. Omri Gillath?
I do.
Omri is spelled Omri, and his last name, like the beautiful resort town in Israel, Eilat, it's Gillath, Gillath, at the Department of Psychology, University of Kansas. Keep sending your research my way. It's always a pleasure to read. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Every time I listen to a researcher who studies attachment, I feel encouraged and I feel inspired. I feel encouraged because it makes me understand that human beings it underscores that we are wired for love and connection. That indeed, having a healthy, secure attachment to somebody is good for our mental health. It's good for our physical health. It helps us live longer. Now, it's not to say that across the lifespan, some of us may have lots of short-term relationships. We may have relationships that overlap with each other. But everybody's got that person, that one person that you can reach out to at 3 a.m. if you need a ride to the emergency room, or somebody to just pick you up at an ungodly hour from the airport. We've all got that person. And that is our secure attachment figure. And if you don't have that person, I encourage you to seek out therapy so you can learn the skills to create that connection. Thanks so much for listening to Mating Matters. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh. Be sure to listen to the Dr. Wendy Walsh radio show on KFI AM 640 Los Angeles and on demand anywhere on the iHeartRadio app.